It was a suffocatingly humid night in Woodville, a small southern town clinging to its dusty past. The streetlights flickered above cracked sidewalks as the hum of old neon signs buzzed outside the local diners and bars. Elijah Brooks stood at the entrance of his barbershop, Brooks & Sons, and inhaled deeply, the scent of fresh-cut hair oil pomade and aftershave still lingering from the day's work. The shop was his pride. It was more than a business. It was a legacy, passed down from his father. For Elijah, every chair in the shop told a story. Each blade and comb had weathered decades of laughter, grief, and lessons exchanged between men from every walk of life. His gaze fell on the sign above the door, simple but bold, painted in deep maroon letters. The street corner felt quiet now, but the silence wasn't peaceful. No, there was an itch in the air, a sense that something ugly was simmering just beneath the town's surface. Elijah ran a hand over his smooth-shaven head, scanning the street as though expecting trouble. He knew trouble in Woodville often wore a badge. They hate what they don't understand, he thought. They hate a man they can't control. He clenched his jaw, forcing the thought away. He wanted to believe people could change. He had always been a patient man, believing respect and kindness could outlast hatred. But patience, lately, felt like an impossible burden. Behind him, the front door jingled open and his nephew Jamal stepped out. Jamal was 16, lanky, with a restless energy that showed in the way he bounced on the balls of his feet. "You sure you don't want to close early, Uncle Eli?" Heard some talk at the gas station, Jamal said, worry flickering in his dark eyes. Elijah gave him a reassuring smile. "Ain't nothing but talk, boy. People get drunk, and their mouths get loose." But Jamal wasn't convinced. "They say the cops were looking for any excuse to come down here tonight. They hate that you keep this place open after all these years." Elijah shook his head slowly, exhaling through his nose. "This shop ain't just a place to cut hair. It's a place folks come to feel seen. As long as people need that, I stay open. No fear's gonna change that." Jamal grumbled but didn't push further. He knew there was no point. Elijah was as steady as stone, calm, patient, and unmovable. But even stones crack under pressure. 2. Across town, the headlights of a patrol car slashed through the darkness, weaving through narrow streets and dim alleys. Officers Jake Miller and Travis Boone sat in the front seats, windows down to let in the sticky night air. Miller, tall with sharp blue eyes, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. His smirk was lazy, a dangerous grin that always followed bad ideas. "You know what pisses me off?" Miller muttered, chewing on a toothpick. Boone glanced over, adjusting his baseball cap. "What now?" Miller gestured with his chin toward the direction of Brooks & Sons, though it wasn't yet visible. "That damn barbershop. Old man Elijah thinks he's better than everyone. Like he's too good to show respect where it's due." Boone shrugged. "Ain't hurting nobody, Jake. Just some old guy cutting hair." Miller's smile twisted. "It ain't the hair. It's the pride. It's the fact that he thinks he can run that place, like he owns the town or something." He spat the toothpick out the window. "Pisses me off." Boone shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but kept quiet. He didn't have the same fire in him as Miller, but it was easier to ride along than stand in the way. And when Miller had an itch to scratch, it usually ended with someone else bleeding. The two officers had a history with Elijah. Small things at first, harassing customers, writing unnecessary fines, pulling over delivery drivers who worked for the shop. It had never been about law and order. It had always been about control. And Elijah refused to bow. That made him a target. "Man thinks he's untouchable," Miller muttered, as if to himself. Then, after a pause, he grinned. "Not tonight." Boone glanced sideways. "Jake, we ain't doing anything stupid, right?" Miller's grin widened. "Stupid? Nah. Just sending a message." He hit the gas. 3. Back at the barber shop. Elijah was locking up for the night. Jamal stood beside him, nervously glancing down the street. "You hear that?" Jamal whispered. His voice was tight with fear. Elijah listened. At first, there was nothing. But then came the low rumble of a patrol car engine, slow, deliberate, like a predator circling prey. The sound made the hair on Elijah's arms rise. The cruiser rolled to a stop right in front of the shop. Miller and Boone climbed out, their faces masked with smug indifference. The streetlight cast long shadows beneath their boots as they sauntered toward the door. Well, Miller drawled, if it ain't the king of Woodville himself. Elijah's face remained impassive, but he could feel Jamal tensing beside him. Evening, officers, he said evenly. What brings you around this time of night? Miller's grin was all teeth. Just keeping the peace, Mr. Brooks. You know how it is. Boone hung back, his eyes avoiding Elijah's. Something flickered in his expression. Regret, maybe, but it was buried beneath fear and the need to fit in. Elijah could sense what was coming. He'd seen it before. Hatred disguised as law. Violence wrapped in a badge. You might want to close up early, Brooks, Miller continued, casually running a hand along the window frame. This ain't the kind of night you want to be out. Elijah held his ground. We were just finishing up, Officer Miller. No trouble here. Miller's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. No trouble yet. He glanced over his shoulder at Boone, who shifted uneasily, then gave a slow nod as if confirming something unsaid. Miller took a step closer, lowering his voice to a whisper only Elijah could hear. You think this town will ever belong to people like you? His tone was venomous, sharp as a razor. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. This town belongs to anyone who builds something worth keeping. Miller's grin vanished. For a moment, the two men stood locked in a silent standoff, two worlds colliding under the weight of centuries of history. Then Miller stepped back, the smirk returning. See you around, Brooks, he said, tipping his hat mockingly. They climbed back into the cruiser and pulled away, tires screeching as they sped down the street. But Elijah knew this wasn't over. The storm was just beginning to gather. For, later that night, Elijah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The encounter gnawed at him, a bitter reminder of the hate that lurked in every corner of this town. He had spent his whole life trying to be the bigger man, patient, kind, forgiving. But patience, he realized, had its limits. He rolled onto his side, watching the moonlight slant through the blinds. In the distance, he heard the faint hum of sirens. And then, somewhere out in the darkness, a single scream tore through the night. A sound so raw and full of terror that it sent chills racing down Elijah's spine. He sat up, heart pounding, and glanced toward the window. In the distance, just beyond the rooftops, a thin plume of smoke was beginning to rise. Elijah bolted from bed, his heart hammering in his chest. His hand shook as he threw on a T-shirt and grabbed his phone from the nightstand. He dialed Jamal's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Come on, kid, he muttered, pacing. The plume of smoke he'd seen earlier wasn't from a random fire. Deep down, Elijah knew exactly what was burning, and who was behind it. Without waiting another moment, he shoved his feet into his shoes and ran out the door, the screen door slamming shut behind him. The night air was thick with heat and the faint but unmistakable scent of something smoldering. Charred wood, plastic, and ruin. It clung to his senses, making his stomach churn. Elijah's house was only a few blocks from the shop, but it felt like miles as his legs pounded the pavement, carrying him toward the street corner that held his family's legacy. When Elijah rounded the corner, the sight hit him like a punch to the gut. His barbershop, the shop his father had built with his bare hands, was engulfed in flames. The windows had been shattered, their glass glittering like jagged stars on the ground. Bright orange fire licked up the wooden frame, roaring as it consumed everything inside. The scent of burnt vinyl and scorched hair filled the air. A neon open sign flickered uselessly amid the blaze, as if unaware that the shop had already been claimed by destruction. Jamal stood on the sidewalk, frozen in disbelief. His brown eyes were wide with fear, and tears glistened on his cheeks, reflecting the inferno's glow. Elijah stumbled to his nephew's side. "Jamal, are you hurt?" Jamal shook his head, swallowing hard. They just left. His voice trembled. It was, Uncle Eli. The cops. I saw them throw something, then boom. It all went up. Elijah's stomach twisted with rage and sorrow. A deep, primal ache spread through his chest as he stared at the fire. Years of memories of laughter, community, and hard work reduced to ashes in minutes. They were laughing, Jamal whispered, his voice hollow. Like it was funny. Elijah clenched his fist so tightly that his knuckles went white. His whole body shook with the effort of holding back a scream. He had always been the calm one, the patient one, but tonight, something inside him cracked. This was more than vandalism. This was a message. A brutal reminder that, in Woodville, there was no room for black men to dream too loud. 3. The fire department arrived 20 minutes later, long enough for the building to be nearly gone. Flames hissed under the spray of the hoses, and black smoke billowed into the sky, blotting out the stars. Elijah stood back, numb, watching the firefighters work. Their faces were expressionless, like they were just going through the motions. None of them looked him in the eye. As the last embers died out, one of the firefighters, a young white man with soot on his cheeks, walked over, pulling off his helmet. "Sorry for your loss," he said flatly, as if offering condolences for a dead pet. Elijah stared at him. "Loss!" His voice was hoarse, rough with grief. This wasn't just a loss. This was arson. The firefighters shifted uncomfortably. "You'll have to take that up with the sheriff's department." Elijah let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and jagged. "Yeah, I'm sure they'll get right on that." The firefighter gave a curt nod and walked away, leaving Elijah standing amid the ruins of his life. 4. Jamal tugged on Elijah's sleeve. "What do we do now, Uncle Eli?" His voice was small, frightened. Elijah placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing gently. "We do what we always do, Jamal. We rebuild." But even as the words left his mouth, Elijah felt the weight of their impossibility. How could they rebuild when the same people who were supposed to protect them were the ones tearing everything down? He looked around at the gathering crowd. Neighbors, customers, people who had come to rely on the barbershop as a place of refuge. Their faces were a mixture of shock, sorrow, and quiet anger. "Eli," a familiar voice called. He turned to see Mrs. Hattie, the owner of the soul food restaurant across the street. She was in her 60s, with silver hair coiled into a neat bun, and her eyes sparkled with the wisdom of someone who had seen too much in her lifetime. "They ain't gonna stop," she said softly, as if reading Elijah's thoughts. "Not until they break you." Elijah swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Then I guess I'll have to show them I don't break easy." Mrs. Hattie gave him a sad smile. "You always were a stubborn one." Elijah glanced back at the smoldering ruins of the barbershop. His heart ached, but underneath the pain, something else stirred, something fierce and unyielding. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. 5. The next morning, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the charred remains of his business license. He had found it in the rubble, blackened around the edges but still legible. It felt like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost, and everything he still had to fight for. Jamal sat across from him, quietly eating a bowl of cereal. The boy's usual energy was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that weighed down the room. Elijah reached across the table and placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "We're going to be okay, Jamal," he said softly. Jamal looked up, his eyes full of doubt. "How?" "They burned everything." "What's left?" Elijah smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "They burned the building, but they didn't burn us. As long as we're still standing, we've got something to fight for." Jamal nodded slowly, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Elijah knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but he also knew that giving up wasn't an option. Not for him. Not for Jamal. Not for anyone who had ever walked through the doors of Brooks and Sons and felt, even for a moment, like they belonged. He stood up, determination settling in his bones. "Come on, Jamal. We've got work to do." Jamal blinked. What kind of work? Elijah's smile sharpened. The kind that makes sure they never forget who we are. Elijah sat in the backyard, rolling a worn coin between his fingers, a habit he'd picked up from his father. The morning light cut through the remnants of last night's smoke, casting long shadows on the lawn. His body was stiff from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. Jamal was inside, slumped on the couch, pretending to watch cartoons. The boy's silence gnawed at Elijah. He'd promised protect him, to be a pillar for him. But how could he protect someone in a town that didn't care whether they lived or burned? Elijah's phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a text from Marcus. Got the word. They're calling it accidental fire damage. No investigation. Elijah cursed under his breath, his fingers tightening around the phone until his knuckles turned white. Of course, the sheriff's department wasn't going to investigate their own people. His mind raced with a dozen bad ideas. Confronting the sheriff directly, organizing a protest, or worse. But he knew he had to play it smart. Anger alone wouldn't win this fight. 2. A knock at the gate pulled him out of his thoughts. When Elijah opened it, he found Carmen standing there, her arms crossed and eyes filled with a mix of worry and frustration. Carmen was Jamal's mother and Elijah's older sister. She lived 2 hours away, working double shifts as a nurse. Despite the distance, she was fiercely protective of both Jamal and Elijah, especially after the boy's father had abandoned them years ago. Elijah, Carmen stepped inside, her voice low but sharp. Why am I hearing about the fire from Mrs. Hattie instead of you? Elijah rubbed his face, already bracing for the storm. I didn't want to worry you. Carmen's eyes narrowed. You didn't want to worry me, or you didn't want me to stop you from doing something stupid? He glanced away, guilt gnawing at him. Carmen always saw through him. Elijah, she softened, brushing a stray curl out of her face. What are you going to do now? I'll rebuild, he said, though the words felt heavy and uncertain. The shop isn't just a business, it's family. Carmen finished for him, her voice softening. I know. She looked over at Jamal through the open screen door. But rebuilding isn't just bricks and paint. It's keeping yourself alive long enough to see it through. I know that too, Elijah muttered, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Carmen stepped closer, lowering her voice. They're watching you, Eli, waiting for you to make one wrong move. Don't give them that satisfaction. He nodded, but her words settled uneasily in his chest. He was running out of patience, and the fire had ignited something inside him that wouldn't be easily extinguished. 3. Later that day, Elijah and Jamal walked to the remnants of Brooks and Sons, hoping to salvage anything that had survived the blaze. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, and ash coated the sidewalk like dirty snow. The charred husk of the building stood as a grim monument to what had been lost. Elijah bent down, brushing debris away from what had once been the counter. His hand found a familiar object, a barber's chair, blackened but intact. He ran his fingers along the armrest, memories flashing before him. His father teaching him to shave, the quiet conversations with customers, the laughter that once filled the room. He glanced at Jamal, who kicked a piece of broken wood with the toe of his sneaker. Why'd they do it, Uncle Eli? The boy asked quietly. Elijah knelt beside him. Because they think if they break us enough times, we'll stop getting back up. Jamal looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. And will we? Elijah smiled, though the weight of his answer pressed hard on his chest. Not a chance, kid. For, that evening, Elijah made his way to the local community center, where Marcus and a small group of neighbors were gathered. They sat in folding chairs beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, the air heavy with frustration and grief. We can't let this slide, Eli, Marcus said as soon as Elijah entered. They burned down the one place that belonged to us. If we stay quiet, they'll think they can do whatever they want. Elijah sat down heavily, dragging a hand across his face. I hear you, man, but we have to be smart about this. Smart? A woman named Keisha, who ran the local bookstore, leaned forward. How much longer are we supposed to stay smart? They've been choking us out for years. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I'm not saying we roll over, Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. But we can't give them a reason to hit back harder. We rebuild the shop. We take care of each other. And we make it clear we're not going anywhere. And what if they come for you again? Marcus asked, crossing his arms. What then? Elijah met his friend's gaze. Then we show them what happens when they mess with family. The room fell silent. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. 5. As the meeting wrapped up, Elijah lingered outside the center, staring up at the night sky. The stars were faint, swallowed by the glow of streetlights and the ever-present haze of smoke from last night's fire. Marcus joined him, lighting a cigarette and offering Elijah one. Elijah shook his head. You ever wonder, Marcus said, exhaling a plume of smoke, how much a man can take before he breaks? Elijah thought about it for a long moment. Every man's got a breaking point, he said slowly, but we get to choose what we do when we reach it. Marcus nodded, flicking the ash off his cigarette. Yeah, but not everyone gets back up. Elijah knew Marcus was right. He could feel it, how close he was to slipping over the edge. But the faces of Jamal, Carmen, and everyone who had ever walked through the doors of Brooks and Sons kept him tethered. He couldn't afford to break. Not yet. We'll get through this, Elijah said quietly, more to himself than to Marcus. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. We better, because I don't think they're done with us. Elijah watched as his friend disappeared into the night, his words hanging heavy in the air. He knew Marcus was right about one thing. This was just the beginning, and whatever was coming next, Elijah would be ready. Elijah woke to the sound of someone pounding on his front door. His heart leapt into his throat. For a moment, still groggy with sleep, he thought the fire had returned, burning away the edges of his life once more. He scrambled out of bed, pulling on a t-shirt as he stumbled toward the door. Jamal peeked out of his room, bleary-eyed and clutching a blanket. Uncle Eli? It's all right, kid, Elijah whispered, though he wasn't sure that was true. He opened the door to find Marcus standing there, his eyes wild with urgency. Get dressed, Marcus said in a low, tense voice. It's happening. Elijah's stomach tightened. What's happening? They're marching to... 20 minutes later, Elijah found himself on the corner of Main and Elm, where a swelling crowd of men, women, and teenagers gathered under the harsh glow of streetlights. Word had spread fast. Brooks and Sons wasn't just a business that burned. It had become a rallying cry. A hum of tension filled the air, like the low rumble of thunder before a storm. Elijah spotted Carmen among the crowd, standing near Keisha and a few other neighbors. She shot him a look, half warning, half approval, before turning back toward the growing commotion. At the front, Marcus stood on the steps of the courthouse, a bullhorn clutched in his hand. They think they can take everything from us. Marcus's voice boomed through the bullhorn, reverberating off the old brick buildings. But tonight we show them. We are not invisible. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices mixing into a single, defiant sound that echoed through the heart of the town. Elijah's chest tightened. This was the kind of thing that could spiral out of control, and yet part of him welcomed it. The reckoning that was long overdue. 3. The crowd began moving, marching through the streets, chanting slogans, their fists raised high. They carried signs with messages of defiance. We build back stronger, not one step back, and our lives matter. Elijah stayed near the back, keeping a protective eye on Jamal, who walked beside him. The boy's face was a mixture of fear and fascination, like he was witnessing something powerful and dangerous unfold before his eyes. You all right, kid? Elijah asked, nudging Jamal's shoulder. Jamal nodded, though his small hands clutched tightly to Elijah's arm. As they passed by darkened storefronts and abandoned lots, Elijah saw faces peeking out from behind curtains, some curious, others fearful. But no one dared come outside. That's how it always was. The people who benefited from the silence never had to raise their voices. They let others do the fighting for them. 4. They reached the sheriff's office, a squat building with a faded American flag hanging limply by the entrance. It stood as a symbol of authority, though to Elijah and everyone here, it represented only the abuse of power. Marcus stepped forward, holding the bullhorn to his lips. "Y'all think we don't see you," he shouted, pointing toward the building. "We see you hiding behind that badge. We see what you did to Brooks and Sons." The crowd surged forward, pressing against the iron fence that separated them from the building. Elijah's pulse quickened. "Stay cool," he murmured to Marcus, catching his friend's eye. "This can't turn ugly." Marcus shot him a glance, half frustrated, half understanding. "We didn't make it ugly, man. They did." Before Elijah could respond, the front doors of the sheriff's office swung open. Sheriff Davenport, a thick-set man with a grizzled beard, stepped out onto the porch, flanked by 2 deputies. "Go home," Davenport barked, his voice amplified by the quiet hostility of the night. "Ain't nothing here for you peoples." The words hit like a slap. "You people." Elijah's hands curled into fists at his sides, anger flaring in his chest. 5. A young man near the front, Elijah didn't know his name, threw a plastic bottle at the steps. It clattered harmlessly against the wood, but the sound was enough to ignite the air like gasoline meeting flame. "Back off," one of the deputies shouted, reaching for the baton at his side. The crowd pressed forward, and Elijah felt the tension snap, unraveling in an instant. People surged against the fence, voices raised in fury. "No!" Elijah shouted, pushing his way to the front. "Not like this." But it was too late. A deputy swung his baton, striking the young man who had thrown the bottle. The boy crumpled to the ground, and chaos exploded around him. People screamed. Shouts of anger and fear filled the air as the crowd pushed forward, and the deputies struggled to hold them back. Elijah grabbed Marcus by the arm. "We need to pull them back." Marcus hesitated, his face twisted with frustration. "They're not going to listen now, Eli. It's gone too far." Elijah knew he was right. The fire had been lit, and there was no stopping it now. 6. In the chaos, Elijah felt a tug on his arm. It was Jamal, his wide eyes filled with panic. "Uncle Eli, we gotta go," the boy shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Elijah scanned the crowd, his heart pounding. He saw Carmen near the back, shouting for people to move away. He saw Marcus grappling with a deputy, rage etched across his face. And then he saw Sheriff Davenport, his hand hovering dangerously close to the holster on his hip. "Get Jamal out of here." Elijah shouted to Carmen, who nodded and pulled the boy into her arms. Elijah stayed where he was, rooted to the spot, as if the ground beneath him had turned to stone. He couldn't leave. Not yet. He watched as Marcus was dragged to the ground, a deputy pinning him down with a knee pressed to his back. Elijah's breath came fast and shallow. The world narrowed to this one moment, this crossroads where everything could still go one way or the other. He stepped forward, raising his hands. "That's enough," Elijah shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Let him go." Davenport's cold eyes locked onto Elijah, and for a moment the sheriff hesitated. And in that moment, Elijah knew whatever happened next would change. Elijah stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, his hands raised as the tension reached a boiling point. The night seemed to hang in suspension, like the air before a thunderstorm unleashes its fury. Sheriff Davenport's hand hovered near his holster, and Marcus lay pinned beneath the weight of a deputy's knee, gasping for air. The crowd raged, but it wasn't just anger fueling them. It was grief, exhaustion, and years of swallowed frustration. Elijah saw it in their faces. He saw it in his own reflection, as if standing on a razor's edge between destruction and hope. "No more," Elijah shouted, his voice cracked, raw with emotion. "We won't lose anyone else to this." The deputy's baton hovered over Marcus's back, ready to strike again, when Davenport barked a command. "Stand down Everything stopped. The sound of the crowd ebbed into tense murmurs, and the deputy slowly stepped back, letting Marcus scramble to his feet. Elijah helped Marcus up, steadying his friend as they both caught their breath. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, an unspoken agreement passing between them. The fight wasn't over. But tonight, they'd do it another way, too. The next morning, Elijah sat with Jamal on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the town in warm hues of gold. The chaos of the night before felt distant, like a bad dream that had lost its sharp edges. "I was scared," Jamal admitted quietly, fiddling with a loose thread on his sleeve. "But I'm glad you didn't fight them." Elijah ruffled the boy's hair, offering a small, reassuring smile. "There are different ways to fight, kid. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is walk away." Jamal nodded, his young mind processing the complexity of what had happened. As they sat in the quiet, Carmen appeared, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to Elijah and sat beside him, her presence a calming balm against the lingering tension in his heart. "You did good, Eli," she said softly, taking a sip from her cup. "Doesn't feel like it," Elijah muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "It will," she replied with a certainty that steadied him. "Change takes time, but it starts with nights like last night." 3. The days that followed weren't easy. The fire at Brooks & Sons had been a turning point, a spark that could have consumed everything if not for cooler heads prevailing. But instead of destruction, it became a call for rebuilding. Marcus organized a community meeting at the church, drawing a crowd larger than anyone expected. Elijah spoke that night, standing at the pulpit with Jamal sitting in the front row, watching him with wide, proud eyes. "We've been through the fire," Elijah said, his voice steady. "But we're still here. And as long as we stand together, they can't burn us down." The room erupted into applause, not just for Elijah, but for everyone who showed up, who refused to let fear or anger tear their community apart. From that night, things began to change. Marcus led efforts to rebuild the store, with neighbors pitching in materials and labor. Carmen started a youth mentorship program, giving kids like Jamal a safe place to learn and grow. Even Sheriff Davenport, grudging as it was, extended a tentative hand toward dialogue. The old power structures didn't crumble overnight, but cracks had formed, and through those cracks, light began to shine. 4 months later, Elijah stood in front of the newly rebuilt Brooks & Sons. The storefront gleamed under the midday sun, a symbol of resilience that made his heart swell with quiet pride. Jamal tugged at his sleeve. "Uncle Eli, can we get ice cream now?" Elijah chuckled, glancing down at the boy. "Yeah, kid, let's go." They crossed the street, where Marcus and Carmen were waiting by the ice cream truck, chatting with neighbors. The warmth between them was unmistakable, the scars of the past slowly healing with every conversation, every act of kindness. As they all sat together, eating ice cream on the steps of the new store, Elijah felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. "You think it'll stay this way?" Marcus asked, his voice low but thoughtful. Elijah smiled, watching Jamal laugh with the other kids. "I think it'll get better." Carmen leaned into his shoulder, her touch light but grounding. "It already is." 5. Elijah didn't believe in perfect endings. Life was too messy for that. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, he knew one thing for sure. The fire had tried to consume them, but they'd chosen to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt like something worth looking forward to. The end